This video has been requested by quite a few people, and The Clash is one of my favorite bands, so I'm super excited to kind of take this look into their story and their music. And as always, if there is a band or an artist that you would like for me to cover in one of these videos, let me know using the comments below, and maybe we'll get to them. So England in the 70s wasn't really a place of prosperity and wealth, at least not for everyone. There was economic despair and politicians who really didn't do anything, so it kind of led to this era of gloominess and despair throughout all of England, but specifically in the epicenter of British culture, which I would consider to be London. All of that kind of set the mood for London teenagers to be angry and pessimistic about the way things were going, and that fueled the mood for a new kind of protest music. At least that's how people like John Lydon and Dave Vanian and Ari Up would probably describe the music that they started making around that time. And in 1975, Mick Jones was also feeling that discontent. He was born in London to a Welsh father and a Russian Jewish mother. After he graduated from the Strand School, he attended the West London School of Art and Design because he thought going to an art college was how you ended up in a band. And if you looked at some of the biggest bands of that time, you would kind of forgive him for thinking that. Mick spent a lot of his teenage years really loving music and following bands around the country. He said that he would sometimes hide in the bathrooms to kind of skip out on train fares, and that he would sometimes sleep on the steps of the town hall just to see his favorite bands play. So he knew pretty early on that he wanted to be around music for the rest of his life. Mick started his first band, which was a glam rock band kind of reminiscent of the New York Dolls, and they called themselves the Delinquents, and they played their first gig in a bar in 1974. That band started to get a little bit of attention around the London underground scene, and then in 1975, he met Tony James, and they formed a band called London SS. London SS formed on the back of the Sex Pistols getting started. Mick saw one of their shows, which people called more chaos than music, and knew that the future of music would look very different after they were done. So he set out to be a part of that new music that was saying something about the world that they saw. He said after seeing the Sex Pistols play, quote, "It was a new scene, new values, so different from what had happened before, a bit dangerous," end quote. London SS were managed by a man named Bernard Rhodes, who most people called Bernie. Bernie was a fashion designer, and he was good friends with Malcolm McLaren, who was also a fashion designer, but is probably most known for being kind of the brain behind what the Sex Pistols were doing. Bernie actually had a shot at managing the Pistols when Malcolm was in New York working on some fashion stuff over there. When Malcolm came back, Bernie actually offered to co-manage the Pistols with him, but Malcolm refused that, so Bernie started to look for something else. Mick, who was actually wearing one of Bernie's designs at the time, approached Bernie after a Sex Pistols show and started to just talk with him about art and society. I think Mick thought Bernie was a musician. I think he thought he was a keyboardist or something, but that was the start of their long relationship. Bernie helped Mick audition different musicians to potentially join London SS, but the band actually broke up before they even played a show. Once that band broke up, Bernie continued on as Mick's manager and started to encourage him to start a new band. So Mick first reached out to a guy named Paul Simonon, who had actually played with London SS for a little bit. Paul's grandfather was a Belgian refugee who had fled to London during World War I. Paul's father was an artist and his mother was a librarian, and Paul always just thought he would be an artist when he grew up, so he also attended art school. He actually originally auditioned for London SS as a singer, but when Mick approached him about this new band, he encouraged Paul to learn an instrument so he could be a part of it. I guess Paul wasn't the best singer. So Paul attempted to teach himself to play bass, but he didn't do it all that well, and by the time The Clash recorded their first album, he still barely knew how to play it. Mick also convinced a guy named Keith Levine to join as a guitarist. Keith was originally way more interested in progressive rock, the style of like Yes and Cream, but meeting Mick turned him on to the new punk sound and everything that could be, so he switched genres. The three of them set about rehearsing with basically any drummer that they could find, but they knew that the important thing was they still needed a lead singer, someone like Johnny Rotten, someone who had that energy and that aura of a frontman, someone who had something to say and had the force to make people listen to him. Bernie thought he knew just the guy, and when he approached the band about it, Mick and Paul actually had already seen him play and knew that they really loved what he was doing. And that guy called himself Joe Strummer, but his real name was John Mellor, and he was born in Turkey to a Scottish mother and an English father. When John, or Joe, was 9, he and his older brother were sent to a boarding school in England that was really tough, and he would sometimes go up to a year without seeing his parents at all. His friend, Julian Temple, said this about the school, quote, "He was dumped on the doorstep of this severely disciplined public school, aged 9, and wouldn't see his parents sometimes for a whole year. This was 1961. Things were very barbaric. He absolutely detested the school and the system that created it. A lot of his rebelliousness came from this," end quote. He actually kind of grew to resent his parents sending him there, especially after 1970, when his brother committed. Joe always blamed their time in the boarding school for causing that. After they had left school, his older brother David had distanced himself from the family and started to get into some not great things. Joe said, quote, "David was a year older than me. Funnily enough, he was a member of the National Front. He was into the occult, and he used to have these death heads and crossbones all over everything. He didn't like to talk to anybody, and I think it was the only way out for him. What else could he have done?" End quote. But Joe's family background also really shaped his music. He grew up visiting his parents in Turkey, India, Mexico, and just all over the world. His first music teacher was a guy in Turkey. And these different musical cultures really impacted the sound of his later work. At school, Joe really fell in love with artists like Little Richard and the Beach Boys and Woody Guthrie. He even went by Woody for a little bit after school. After he graduated from that boarding school, he also attended an art school with the idea that he would be a cartoonist. But then he started performing. He bought a ukulele, and someone taught him how to play the song Johnny Be Good. So he started busking with his ukulele and his one song. He said, quote, "I was on my own for the first time with this ukulele and Johnny Be Good, and that's how I started." End quote. A lot of his art school friends said that Joe always knew he would be a successful musician, like he had some kind of power to see the future or something. For a while, Joe moved to South Wales, where he started to sing with a band called Flaming Youth that later changed their name to The Vultures. But when that band fell apart, he moved back to London and started staying in this crappy squat place, and he formed a new band with his roommates called the 101ers, which was named after the address of the squat that they were staying in. Joe said about that band, quote, "We formed a rock and roll band called the 101ers and rented this room above a pub. We charged people 10 pence to get in, and it was full of filthy, crazy squatters and drunken gypsies. Bloody mayhem. It kicked off regularly, but we always carried on playing, bottle and tables flying like the Wild West," end quote. The 101ers started to play in different pubs and different clubs around London, and that's where Mick, Paul, and Bernie first saw Joe perform. By that point, Joe had stopped calling himself Woody and had started going by the name Joe Strummer, kind of as an homage to his days busking with his ukulele. By the time Mick approached Joe about this new band, Joe was primed to make the switch. He had kind of gotten a little bit fed up with the 101ers. He had also seen the Sex Pistols, and he knew that something different was happening that he wanted to be a part of. He said about seeing the Pistols play, quote, "I knew something was up, so I went out in the crowd, which was fairly sparse, and I saw the future, with a snotty handkerchief right in front of me. It was immediately clear. Pub rock was, hello, you bunch of drunks, I'm going to play these boogies and I hope you like." The Pistols came out that Tuesday evening, and their attitude was, "Here's our tunes, and we don't care whether you like them or not. In fact, we're going to play them even if you hate them." End quote. So this new band, formed out of the ashes of London SS, approached Joe after a 101ers gig and asked him to attend a rehearsal. At that gig, Keith actually played a song that Joe had written. And then Bernie gave Joe 48 hours to decide whether he wanted to be a part of this new band. Joe took less than 24 hours before he agreed. Glenn Matlock, who was a lot of the creative force behind the Pistols' early days, thought that Joe was a little bit too old to join this new band, but he really liked the authenticity of Joe's experience and the things he had to say. But Mick said that all the band members really clicked right away, and it all just came together at the right time. In the early era of the band, they played with a few different drummers, but Terry Chimes was the one that stuck, even though he never really liked Joe. He was never officially offered a spot in the band, he just kind of fell into it. They had also tried out a few different names until Paul came up with the name The Clash. Paul said, quote, "It really came to my head when I started reading the newspapers, and a word that kept recurring was the word clash. So I thought, The Clash, what about that?" And they and Bernie, they went for it. End quote. They rehearsed for only about a month before they played their first gig, which was opening for the Sex Pistols. Basically, the only reason they played that gig that they were not prepared for was to say that they had played before The Damned, which was another band that was kind of an offshoot of London SS, and they were scheduled to play 2 days later. The Clash didn't play again for over a month because Bernie said they needed to be way tighter before they got back out there. During this time, Joe said that they were kind of overly zealous in their dedication to this band. They had to shed basically everything that they knew before the Clash, both musically and personally. They got rid of old friends, they got rid of old styles of playing and old influences, and really just poured everything that they could into the Clash. They started to write some of their own music, and Joe said that he really didn't care if people liked it or not, kind of harnessing that attitude of the Pistols and Johnny Rotten. Joe and Mick did most of the band's writing, with Joe handling the lyrics and Mick handling the instrumentation. Bernie really encouraged them to write about the big issues of the day and share their perspective and their opinion, which really brought out this political nature in the Clash that a lot of other bands weren't really doing at that time. In September of 1976, Keith Levine was fired from the band. He had started to grow pretty dissatisfied with the whole project, and he had even started talking with Johnny Rotten about a new band that they could form. And after the Pistols broke up, Keith and Johnny formed a band called Public Image Limited. Keith ended up leaving Pill in 1983, and he ended up working as a producer for a bit, occasionally dipping his toes back in the performing world, but mostly staying behind the scenes, until he passed away from liver cancer in 2022 at the age of 65. Later that year, Terry Chimes also left the band. Terry kind of bounced around with a few different bands, including Gen X and Hanoi Rocks, and he currently plays drums for the band The Crunch. And he also owns his own chiropractic office in Essex called Chimes Chiropractic. By 1977, punk was all the rage, and the Clash had started to pick up quite a following just playing local gigs, which led to the Clash signing a massive, very controversial record deal. It was with CBS for £100,000, and it was seen by a lot of people in the punk community as selling out. The founder of the leading punk magazine at the time, which was called Sniff and Glue, said, quote, "Punk died the day the Clash signed to CBS," end quote. But Joe said about this deal, quote, "I'm not going to suddenly turn into Rod Stewart just because I get 25 pounds a week," end quote. Despite that early controversy, their contract now is kind of seen as an example of a contract that no band should ever sign. They basically had to pay for everything. They paid for their own recording, their own artwork, their own tours, basically everything. They brought Terry Chimes back in for their first recording, and that record, which was a self-titled album, completely assuaged the fears of their critics. It reached number 12 in the charts and is now seen as one of the best punk albums of all time. They included a cover of a reggae song on that album, which really showcased their influence from different styles of music and would become a staple of the way they did things from then on. After the recording of that album, Terry left the band again, and he said, quote, "The point was I wanted one kind of life and they wanted another. And like, why are we working together if we want completely different things?" End quote. And that kicked off a massive search for a new drummer. Joe said they must have tried every person in London with a kit and said they probably auditioned over 200 drummers until they found Topper Hedden, which was a guy who had played very briefly with London SS. Topper, who was born Nicholas Hedden in Kent, was a big jazz fan growing up. His biggest drumming influence as a kid was a guy named Billy Cobham. He had actually played with a progressive rock band called Mirkwood, which had the chance to open for some really big artists. When he joined the Clash, he kind of viewed it as a stepping stone. He said he wanted to establish himself as a drummer before moving on to a different project, which more closely aligned with the style that he enjoyed. But then he ended up recognizing the potential of the band and the musicians in it, and he stayed. He was nicknamed Topper by Paul, who apparently had a way with naming things, because he looked like a character in the Topper comic books. So, with the addition of Topper, the kind of classic lineup of the Clash was established, with Joe Strummer, Mick Jones, Topper Hedden, and Paul Simonon. With the addition of Topper, they were able to really evolve their sound and play some more intricate music. The band went on some pretty big tours just to kind of try to establish who they were, but they had started to get really fed up with CBS. The label actually ended up releasing a single from the second album that the band all thought was one of the worst songs on the album. In 1978, the Clash kind of did a pretty big thing when they played a show called Rock Against Racism. The National Front had started to pick up a lot of steam in England, and Joe was a militant anti-fascist. Punk had previously flirted a little bit with Nazi imagery, probably just a part of that whole rebellion thing, rebelling against parents who were very strictly anti-Nazi coming out of World War II and just kind of trying to do anything that would shock and awe. You can see that with Sid Vicious and his love of wearing swastikas. But Joe did a lot to kind of disassociate the genre from that. CBS asked the band to make a cleaner sound for their second album, which resulted in some really terrible recording sessions. And as a result of all that, the band ended up firing Bernie. The album, called Give 'Em Enough Rope, despite very mediocre critic reviews, ended up reaching number 2 in the charts. But it really did nothing to break them out in America, which was what CBS was really trying to do. They did see that massive American breakthrough with their album released in 1979 in the UK and 1980 in the States, called London Calling. Before they actually started recording this album, Mick and Joe had faced quite a lot of writer's block and showed up to the recording sessions with no new songs. So they developed a really strict daily routine that included playing football together as a band and going to pubs, just kind of building that camaraderie within the group. And that really helped give them some of their confidence in each other and themselves back. The resulting album was adored by critics and is still seen as one of the greatest albums of all time. Their newfound success continued and exponentially increased with everything they did, and the band really struggled with that. It grew farther and farther away from their do-it-yourself punk roots. After the release of their fifth album, Combat Rock, in 1982, the band started to fall apart. At the start of 1983, they were kind of on top of the world in the sense of their success, even playing with bands like The Who at Shea Stadium. But behind the scenes, things were kind of a struggle for them. Paul said, quote, "In my opinion, we were just moving further away from our audience and becoming like every other big wank rock and roll stadium band like Led Zeppelin who played there. Me and Joe hated all of that." So 1983, which was their biggest year as a band, was also the start of the end. In 1983, Topper was asked to leave the band because his drug addiction had gotten so bad that he had become unreliable. Terry Chimes came back in to kind of fill that void for a little bit, but he was soon replaced. They ended up playing in California in front of 140,000 people, and that would prove to be Mick Jones' last show with The Clash. By that point, Mick was becoming very unreliable. Paul and Joe wanted to keep touring and keep pushing forward with the success, but Mick wanted some time off. Mick has later said that he really regretted the way he acted during that period, but by that point, he and Paul weren't even speaking with each other, and Joe was just fed up with everything. Joe said they had too much to do to beg someone to play the guitar, so they kicked him out, and they were never quite the same after that. Paul said, quote, "Me and Joe knew we were cutting off our right arm when we decided that Mick had to go. But the fact is that we had just had enough of him and didn't want to play safe and keep the charade going. So we said, well, that's it," end quote. Apparently, Joe spent basically the rest of his life trying to get that creative partnership with Mick going again, even sending him lyrics in 2001. Because Mick was half of the creative force behind The Clash, he wrote the music to Joe's lyrics. They weren't the same without him. Mick and Paul tried to keep The Clash going by recruiting some new musicians and going on a few new tours, and they even recorded a new album, but they broke up before that album was released. The album came out in 1985, and it was called Cut the Crap, which was exactly what the critics thought The Clash should do. It was not well received, and honestly is not an album that I like all that much. I think it is missing half of the creative force behind it, honestly. Joe said about the split, quote, "When The Clash collapsed, we were tired. There had been a lot of intense activity in 5 years. Secondly, I felt we'd run out of idea gasoline. And thirdly, I wanted to shut up and let someone else have a go at it," end quote. After being fired, Mick started a project called Big Audio Dynamite, which did its best to mix a whole bunch of different musical styles together. And he's worked as a producer off and on for a bit. After the split, Paul formed a new band called Havana 3AM, and started to work as an artist, putting on several different gallery shows. He reunited with Mick Jones when both of them played on the third Gorillaz album. He announced a new solo project in 2023, so we'll see what happens with that. Topper Headon played briefly with some other bands and even released his own album in 1986. But by the late 80s, things were going pretty badly for him. He had to drive minicabs and busk in the London Underground in order to afford his heroin addiction. He's undergone some pretty big health struggles since then, but he seems to be doing better now, so hopefully he's on the up and up. Joe, as you would expect, did quite a lot of work after The Clash. He formed various other bands, did some solo projects, and even had a bit of an acting career. Joe was kind of seen as the voice of this rebellious rock music. By making things political and by blending in different styles from different races, Joe was very loved and respected within the community, and his voice carried a whole lot of weight up until his death. On the 22nd of December in 2002, he was found dead by his wife. He had suffered a heart attack due to an undiagnosed heart condition, and he was only 50 years old. It's really hard to overstate just how important the Clash were. They were massively influential to countless musicians across the musical spectrum. Their ability to confront social issues and really speak up about what they knew was important changed the focus of rock music and changed what it could be and what it could do. And their incorporation of so many different musical genres within punk changed punk forever. For at least a time, they were truly the only band that mattered. So that's the story of The Clash. I do want to say I know there's a lot more I could have said about this band, particularly in the latter part of their career, but what I find the most interesting and what I choose to focus on is a lot of the earlier stuff. I love seeing how people went from being regular, ordinary people to realizing their dreams and doing something with that. There's countless videos, countless articles about what happened when they were The Clash, that early 80s to the split. So if you want to learn more about that, I can recommend some resources. But if you enjoy kind of what I enjoy and this focus on sort of the earlier part and the story behind the music, the story behind the bands we all love, consider subscribing because that's what I love to focus on. So I'll be releasing more of these. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, if you learned anything, and as always, drop a comment below with your thoughts, with whether or not you like The Clash as well, and any recommendations of bands you think I should cover.